All right, so we will turn our attention to another matter when we return. Please stay with us.
Page 357.
In 2019, the Senate constituted an ad hoc committee to examine the challenges confronting the country's electricity sector and why regular supply of electricity to Nigerians continue to be elusive. The committee held a roundtable discussion as well as several meetings and has come up with a report which the chairman presents during Wednesday's plenary session. Some of the resolutions recommended in the report include the introduction of cost-reflective tariffs, immediate removal of increased custom duties of 35% to allow meter asset providers clear meters stuck at the airports, elimination of political interference from the NERC, alignment of the electricity value chain. But some senators argue that constant electricity will be a mirage in Nigeria with the present structure.
I want to say that privatization was very, very faulty. Both the DISCO, the GENCO, that is given into private hands, was highly compromised.
We need to get to the depth of this. There's a total mess and rot in this whole power sector. And I'm even for cancelling the whole thing and we just start again and maybe buy back these some of these DISCOs and find a structured way to pay them off.
Federal lawmakers were also alarmed at the disclosure by the chairman of the Power Committee that Nigeria stands to lose $1.2 billion if it pulls out of an agreement with Azura power plant to supply 450 megawatts of electricity monthly. According to the agreement, Nigeria loses roughly $30 million monthly to Azura IPP for gas generated, as the contract makes it mandatory for Nigeria to pay the sum whether or not the power generated is dispatched or transmitted through the national grid by the Transmission Company of Nigeria.
As a lawyer, I have looked at those agreements, especially the ones of Azura and Apu Gas. The way we are so tied is that the danger in Azura and Apu Gas is that if we default, they can draw down immediately from our foreign reserve. That is how we've been tied up. Once we default, they can go straight without reference to anything, and we signed and draw down from our foreign reserve.
In the light of genuine commitment, not only to ourselves, to the generation unborn, we must get solution to this problem and this problem now, please. And that is my submission.
The Senate is consequently calling for a review of all the existing contracts, including those on privatization. The upper chamber is also urging government ministries, departments and agencies to make provision to cover outstanding debts owed to distribution companies in the 2021 budget. Linda Akibi, Channels Television News.
Welcome back. Well, yes, indeed, Dr. Ayodele Oni joins us next. He is an energy law and policy expert to weigh in on all of these matters. Good morning, and thank you for joining us today.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, you know how it is with electricity supply. So whatever agreements, whatever plans, programs that exist, if people don't see that they've got this on all the time, they will ask questions. So now there's been calls for renegotiation, cancellation of deals, start all over again. And now they talk about this Azura deal. What do you think of all of these calls, particularly for this particular deal?
Well, that's an interesting question. One thing we all fail to realize, however, is as answering the question, how desperate we were at that time. at the times we entered into those contracts, we indeed needed a lot of power supply. And the story hasn't changed. I understand that to the average Nigerian, what they want to see is electricity. But if it took us 30, 40, 50 years to destroy the sector, I think it's going to be unfair to expect that in a few years, things will go back to normal or things will be perfect. I do understand that some of those contracts, there may be issues, but they are pretty much commercial contracts. I don't see any mischief. I don't see any fraud in any of those contracts. That's my view. And I think you can't reverse the privatization at this time. It's going to have an adverse ripple effect, whether it's whether to the banking sector, across board. And it's not going to speak well of Nigeria as an investment destination. Those are my initial thoughts.
But you know, when you hear the Chairman Senate Committee on Power say, look, I'm a lawyer, and I know that these agreements that we signed, if we default, they will draw down about $1.2 billion from our foreign reserves. You assume that he's speaking from the point of knowledge. But the MD of the company several times reading his article saying, look, they don't know where they got those figures from, that those are not actually true. So when you hear both statements, you can only wonder, what's going on?
Okay, yeah, very interesting. The Azura deal is a very interesting deal. It's private sector driven, and it did get a number of support from the government in terms of the partial risk guarantee, the World Bank partial risk guarantee, actually coming from the IBRD, International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. I mean, one of the two institutions that make up the World Bank. That's distinct from the World Bank Group, which is a broader, which has got a number of other institutions. Now, what must have happened is that they entered into a number of contracts. And this is what we see in the power sector, particularly because privatization is nascent in this part of the world with respect to the power sector. You know, if I take you back memory lane, you'd remember in 2010, there was the roadmap by the JEJ administration, that's Dr. Goodluck Jonathan administration. The idea was to kickstart the sector. We had the Electric Power Sector Reform Act, and we had the National Electric Power Policy. And those had not been implemented. If we had implemented those properly, we probably wouldn't be where we are today. So the government thought it was best to implement both documents, the policy and the law. And one of those things was to ensure there was privatization and to encourage and attract international investment. When Azura was negotiated, there was a power purchase agreement, and there was a put call option agreement. No one was going to come and invest in Nigeria. If you recall very well, there was the idea of the partial risk guarantee because no one was going to invest in generation because the distribution companies were not able to collect up to even 50% of the power sold. So if I invested in generation, it then means I'll pass on power to the consumers through the distribution companies, and then I won't be able to get my money back. Even if I sell through the bulk trader, which is NBET, which was what Azura sought to do, NBET would not be able to recover its monies from the distribution companies, who in turn would, and then NBET would then not be able to pay Azura. So Azura had to think about, and the promoters and its lawyers had to think about creative ideas. And one of those things was the put call option agreement. And it also because you need to look at political risk, country risk. Okay, Nigeria is a destination. We've seen situations where contracts have been cancelled, there have been issues. We need to ensure that in the event that government does cancel this deal, they are obliged to then buy the power plant. And there is a formula in that document, both in the PCOA and the PPA for situations such as those. So it's not a situation paying a $1.2 billion. I don't think that's accurate. You won't see that anywhere in that contract. It's just that if you breach a contract, there'll be punitive measures taken, liquidated damages and all of those. That's what you see in the PCOA and the PPA.
So
and of course there was a partial.
So okay, you're suggesting that he may have come to that conclusion himself, but not based on the agreement that was signed.
Yes, not based on a complete understanding of the commercial structure and the structure for that particular independent power project.
Okay,
because
so
every project go on.
So for a PPA, if one defaults, the character of PPAs, what should one expect?
Okay, it will depend. It will depend on a number of things. First, you would typically have a take or pay provision in your PPA, because remember that these projects are project financed. And when I use project finance, I don't use literally, I use in a technical manner, where you would have obtained substantial sums, and repayment will be based on incomes generated from that project. You cannot rely on the balance sheet of the company. So what you first have is a take or pay obligation. So if government does not take that power, if the TCN cannot wield that power due to no fault of Azura, there's an obligation to pay a certain amount, pay for a particular quantum of power. That's basically what I see. That's the first level. Another level which you typically see is then a buyout clause, or what you might have in the PCOA, a situation where if you do not, if there are certain situations where government defaults, and those defaults are fundamental, then Azura can pack up and say, you know what, you have an obligation to buy this plant from us, and this is the formula. The formula is pre-agreed. It's in the PPA, it's in the PCOA. So you pay us X amount based on number of years left, based on what the revenues would have generated and all of those. So I think he might not be speaking from a complete understanding of the contractual structure and the nuances and the requirements at that time. We're desperate. Recall from the 2010 roadmap, we thought by 2020 we would have about 40,000 megawatts of power. So government was desperate. Government believed that with Manitoba Hydro, if you remember that management contract with Manitoba Hydro, government believed that the transmission network would be fine, will be able to wield sufficient power. I guess that's why they went into that contract. Okay. So I do not see any mischief or fraud.
Dr. Just one moment. There was an issue that you raised earlier when Chimelin asked you a question about, the chances of default, and I would like you to expatiate on that. Perhaps that is the issue that the Senate or the National Assembly is concerned about. Well, you also referenced the fact that Nigeria signed a sort of a sovereign guarantee, and which, of course, just as you have also said, if there is a default, there is a liability. What are the chances of that default on our part, and what are the liabilities?
Okay, I'll take you back a little. You'd be speaking to the indemnity agreement signed by the federal government. You know what I think there are two key issues. The take or pay, maybe three issues. The take or pay under the PPA, the put and call option under the PCOA, and the World Bank partial risk guarantee. Now, for you to obtain the World Bank partial risk guarantee, there are at least three pieces of documentation. You've got a standby letter of credit, which the bulk trader would have given to Azura, for example, and in return, they'll get that standby letter of credit from the bank, from a commercial bank, and the commercial bank will want some form of guarantee that if Azura does draw down that standby letter of guarantee, it will get repaid, to get its money back from the bank. If it doesn't then get its money back from the bank, then the federal government needs to step in. That's where that sovereign guarantee of some sort, an indemnity, comes into play. So there needs to have been a number of defaults before you get there. So the chances are there, but the chances are minimal. So the first point where you may have a challenge is under the take or pay. So if you do not take power due to no fault of the IPP, for example, you would be obliged to pay an amount, whether it's take or pay or whether it's a capacity charge, such that whether or not you use that electricity, you pay X amount. I understand people have said $30 million and all of those. Also, because of confidentiality, I cannot go into specifics of that contract. Even though I have seen that contract myself, I can't go into specifics. That's one angle, take or pay. The other angle is when there's a more fundamental default. And then Azura, the investors, the promoters say, you know what, we're leaving Nigeria. You need to buy us out. We don't want this plant anymore. Or we're selling all of our shares to the federal government. And then the federal government is obliged to buy those shares. There could be a waiting period of, say, 1 year. There'll be those dynamics. But the danger in that default and in not fulfilling your obligations is that like the P&ID case, they can then take it to international arbitration. And if you look at the NIPC Act, I think it's section 24, 25, it gives leeway for international arbitration when you enter into such contracts. And that's it. And that also even goes to the issue around waiver of sovereign immunity, which has been controversial recently. I won't go into that because I've not been asked. So that's it. The chances are there, but I think it's in the extreme that those will happen. The first level will be the take or pay, where we would have to pay an amount whether or not we use that electricity. And we were desperate at that time.
Wow. Now that you bring up the sovereignty clause, just so you know, you are now being asked. Can you break it down so we'll understand? Like you said, it's been controversial. And for a lot of Nigerians, they want to know, what did we get ourselves into? And how do we even wiggle out of this, or at least wiggle around? So what does that entail, really?
Okay. Much of this is exaggerated in my view. Now, there is sovereignty. There is giving up your sovereignty. And there is the concept of waiver of sovereign immunity. I'll take you a bit historical. When you sue a sovereign, in fact, in some cases, you cannot even sue a sovereign. In many other cases, when you do sue that sovereign, and you have the opportunity, or you've gotten a judgment or an arbitral award, you cannot even enforce that. So imagine I lend someone money. Someone I know would typically default. That person then gives me security or collateral that is reasonable. I would want to go into that contract based on that security, especially if the returns are high. But imagine that even I cannot enforce that security, or I cannot take that security when the person defaults, particularly someone who is known to default regularly. That's what waiver of sovereign immunity is. Waiver of sovereign immunity just means that when you sue me, that just means that you can't sue me. One, you can. I've waived my right not to be sued. Secondly, you can enforce judgment against me. It's not an assignment of Nigeria's sovereignty. It's not. It's wrong to say that. It's just waiving an immunity you have. An immunity not to be sued, or an immunity such that enforcement cannot be made against you. That's what it means. It's not selling our sovereignty.
Shed some further light on this for us, if you will. Perhaps if I could hypothesize on this one. So, assuming maybe Party A gets an Exim Bank facility for a while, it's been executed, there's no default. And then Party A goes to source B and sources some facility, to develop certain infrastructure. And it turns out that that sovereignty clause is there. Now, in that regard, having looked at the record, if the person hasn't defaulted, or even if you default, maybe like a very negligible percentage, what does that entail if one were to activate sovereignty clause, having signed any of those? Does it allow the issuing party, the funding party, to pick and choose whatever facility they want, or how does that play out?
Okay, good question. Typically, what happens in commercial contracts, facility agreements and all of those, that structure, you'd have your security or collateral. So you have your security, which may be registrable or may not be. It's that security you typically chase. But for sovereigns, it will be a situation where you would have a money judgment, for example, or you may have assets like buildings offshore. It's unlikely that another sovereign will come into your country to seize your assets. That's not what happens. You get a money judgment, for example, under an arbitral award, and then you seek to enforce that. It's when that country then says, I would not give you that money, that you begin to consider its assets outside of that country. You wouldn't even go into that country to seize its assets. That's the way it works. So it's unlikely that it will be money judgment usually. That just answers the question. It will typically be a money judgment, except you've created security over certain assets.
Is it supposed to be specified? So even if it's not specified?
No, if it's not specified, it will be money. Yeah, even if it's not specified, yes. You sue you sue that country, you go to international arbitration, and you get an arbitral award. It will be money, and then you try to enforce it. That's where the waiver comes in.
So, just to be clear, I know this is kind of thorny, just to be clear. So, right after that, if, fails to pay the money and then assets come into play, will they still be able to pick and choose those assets?
Okay, no. Yes and no. No, because there are certain assets you necessarily cannot touch. Military assets, you probably won't go into that country to take their assets. But if they have buildings outside the country, they have certain other assets. You know, countries usually have assets outside of their own jurisdiction. Those are what people or other sovereigns or other countries, DFIs, will typically change. But it usually never gets there. It usually never gets to that situation. And I can tell you that Nigerian negotiators have really done a great job in terms of ensuring that those assets that can be touched are not those that are fundamental to the country. One. Secondly, what you would even have more recently will be forward sale arrangements, where it doesn't even get to the assets in that sense.
Judging from the statements made at the Senate, it appears as though, the lawmakers are not pleased with that agreement. In fact, they're calling for a review, saying we need to look at this and ensure that it works for us. So stepping back a bit, I mean, you look at that take or pay agreement, or as you have called it. I mean, it sounds as though you continue milking a cow you're not exactly feeding, because if the country is not taking that power that is, generated, but you still have to pay on a monthly basis. It sounds as though you keep milking that cow, even though you're not feeding that cow as much. I mean, isn't that what it comes across as?
Not necessarily, and I'll explain why. Recall that every contract has got its tenor or its term. That's first point. Second point is, recall that investor has borrowed monies from the bank, and you've got a repayment schedule. So it's L or I water. So there's a minimum amount that has to be generated every month, or else that project in the first place will not be bankable. You wouldn't have that project. You wouldn't have your bridges. You wouldn't have your power plants. You wouldn't have a lot of infrastructure, because no one's going to lend them money except there's a guaranteed periodic payment. Can be a weekly, can be a monthly. That's why in infrastructure type projects, you'd have capacity payment, you'd have take or pay. Take or pay more common for gas projects. Capacity payments more common for electricity. So that's what it is. Otherwise, no one's going to lend you money. No lender, if it's conditional or it's contingent, no lender is going to lend you money, because they need to have their own model. So there's a base model, if financial model, that suggests that every month you'd make at least X amount, which would maybe be your capacity payment or your take or pay payment. So you'd also need to look at it from the investor's point of view, not just from the country's point of view, because the country has asked that investor to come in to invest borrowed sums, investors' monies, shareholder loans, shareholder funds, all of those. So you can't jeopardize it. You need to take it into consideration. Otherwise, being a third world country, you would get no projects if you do not accede to certain things. And even most countries in the world would. The US, you'd see situations, particularly when you go into contracts with the government, and when you go into contracts where their country, go into contracts with sovereigns where their country risk, or there are issues around the credit worthiness of the regime, then you need to be fair. You need to look at it from everyone's point of view. You need to look at the lenders, you need to look at the project developer, and then you need to look at the country. So who wants it the more? Does the country need power more than the developer needs to build that plant in Nigeria? They can take it to Sierra Leone, Senegal, Cameroon, anywhere else. So it would be unfair to just conclude that it's milking a cow. You went in, and also, like I said before now, there was some foundation to it. The belief was that the transmission system will be much better than it is today. That's why they brought in Manitoba Hydro under a management contract. So that's what it is. Yeah, you could call it that. So there are always two sides to a coin. You could call it milking, and it may also not be, depending on whether you're being fair and you look at it from everybody else's point of view too, beyond yours.
Let me attempt to see if I could take those views in context here, as you say. Now, the investor, perhaps the private sector investor, when you say that we're desperate and country is in there to sign certain guarantees, now, still on that take or pay part of the entire deal. So yes, we know that the authorities there, perhaps the government, should have ensured that they have their own end of the bargain, so that in terms of when you take, you have the facility or capacity to distribute. So one assumes that if you're going into that kind of deal as a private sector investor, you'd have had all of those things figured out. Was that what played out here from what you saw?
Oh yeah, that's what played out. I mean, the private sector was going to cover the basis. Recall that they had some of the best lawyers internationally. They had DFIs, development finance institutions. We had some of the most sophisticated lenders, and they weren't going to take chances. And recall that you had serious country risks. You were just leaving. I'm not sure we had any regime change in democracy. You're a military country just coming out of military rule. You are known to have in the past, you are taking over assets. If British Petroleum became African Petroleum, there's been expropriation, whether it's creeping expropriation or direct expropriation. So all of those are taken into consideration when a call is made by both the lenders and the investors as to the bankability of that project. So yes, I mean, that's what it is. The private sector is going to cover their business. If I were to advise an investor, of course, I'm going to ask for many of these things. I know some of these things can no longer, we probably will never have a second Azura, but I mean, if I were to advise, I would ask for similar guarantees. I would ask for similar collateral, similar sort of contracts. That's the truth.
Okay, because I know that
I wasn't a lawyer worth my salt.
Okay, this is a power deal. So it's usually kind of different when investors are going into certain things and then they want the government to guarantee such that investors or those who are financing don't lose their money, because, I mean, people think that some parties have a reputation. They always have to have, or they want to have their own end of the bargain sorted. But concerning the take-up here as well, sorry, I need to just take one more perspective on this particular matter. Now, when we take that power, is there any reason right now for us to be concerned about this deal, as the Senate seems to suggest?
Well, is there any reason to be concerned? I'll say yes and no. No, to the extent, if we can't take that power. Yes, if we absolutely cannot. Now, our not being able to take it is purely our own fault, purely our own decisions or lack thereof, purely our own. So you can't really blame the private sector. So I think it's a yes and no. Yes, considering the quantum you'll be paying monthly, whether or not you take that power. And no, because, I mean, the project took, 7 years? So in those 7 years, we should also have covered our bases. That's my own view.
Essentially, you're saying anyway. There is nothing we can do about this. We have to pay whether we can afford it or not, because that's what this sounds like.
It's not affordability. It's contracts. I mean, contract are sacrosanct. Imagine you paid 100 million naira for a property. Oh yeah, of course you can always. Parties choose to review contracts, and usually contracts would have review clauses. However, in that review, there will be basis for review. Is there a change in law? Is there a change in taxation? Is there a change in the economics of the project? You don't just wake up and say you want to change contracts. Or else it goes to the root of the sanctity of contracts. And everyone is going to say, you know what, Nigeria is not a good investment destination. I'm going elsewhere. I'm going to Ghana. I'm going to Cote d'Ivoire. I'm going to Senegal. That's it. You don't just sign contracts. It took 7 years. It took maybe more to sign those contracts. So you can't wake up one day and just say we will. You can ask to renegotiate. I mean, you just need the other party to be reasonable. But in negotiating, remember that it's going to have a multiplier effect. Those guys have borrowed monies from countries, from shareholders, from even depositors' funds. So it's not as straightforward as we think it is. It's not. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad bargain. I mean, if our infrastructure is up to date.
All right. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Ayodele Oni, an energy law and policy expert, is also the partner at Bloomfield Law Practice. Thank you for your thoughts this morning.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right. We're back in a moment, everyone. Stay with us.